Thank you very much, Kirsty. It's glad to be here, particularly after Kirsty's traffic advice yesterday. So my name is Mark Hopkins. So now we're all satiated after lunch. We're going to talk about appetite, and I'm going to look at how diet and exercise-induced energy deficits alters appetite control. I'm just going to start by acknowledging the rest of the team. That's a kind of tacit acknowledgement that I might overrun slightly, so I'll get it out of the way here. I'm really lucky at the University of Leeds to work with individuals that kind of know their way around appetite quite well. So I'm really lucky in a lot of the slides and ideas, come from a kind of group rather than just myself. So just to kind of start with that acknowledgement. So in terms of the talk itself, I'm just going to start by providing, is it going already? A bit of a whistle-top tour of appetite control and energy balance regulation, just to try and orientate some individuals that are perhaps not familiar with some of the concepts to the area. And then I'm going to start to look at how dietary-induced weight loss alters some of these control mechanisms, and also then start to look at acute and short-term and long-term exercise interventions, and really try and get a feel for how these different types of energy deficit alter the control of food intake. And then I'm just going to finish up at the end by talking a little bit around perhaps the differences between diet and exercise and their effects on appetite. So hopefully it's a nice change of scene from this morning, which is a little bit more around energy expenditure. So I guess I don't need to talk to this audience too much about energy balance, but I think there's a couple of key concepts that we need to talk about just to help us understand this kind of idea of compensation to energy deficits. So we see this kind of very simplistic view of energy balance still depicted in kind of the sort of lay press, but also some scientific kind of journals. But when we start to think about energy balance, we need to think about it as this complex interaction between physiology and behaviour. And if we start to look at some of the individual components and how they interact, we can see why it's perhaps really difficult for us to elicit long-term weight loss in individuals. So if we start by looking at some of the factors that influence food intake, for example, we know that the different macronutrients in the diet have hierarchical effects on satiety, for example. And alcohol, we don't seem to see any downward compensation for the calories that we consume through alcohol. But to add this sort of extra layer of complexity to some of these nutritional factors, we also have psychological sensations or factors that we know seem to predict food intake. So we have things like hunger, satiation and satiety, but also things like food preference and food reward that seem to have a big impact on the foods that we choose and perhaps when we can consume those foods. But we also have an array of physiological signalling systems that are thought to influence or act as physiological cues for those psychological sensations. I'm going to talk about these in a little bit more detail in a few slides, but we essentially have a longer-term tonic system and a shorter-term episodic meal-to-meal type system that where we have the release of these gastrointestinal hormones and say leptin and fat that act as cues for our subjective sensations. So straight away we can see energy intake as this complex relationship between physiology and behaviour. And I haven't even started to talk about the central regulation of appetite there, or kind of superimpose the environment onto those kind of mechanisms. And if we wanted, we could do exactly the same with energy expenditure. And I'm not going to go into this in any great depth because people have talked about it, but we can start to look at the individual components of total day energy expenditure. And if we wanted, we could look at those determinants. And we know that, already that fat-free mass is the main determinant of total day resting energy expenditure. If we wanted, we could look at the individual tissue organ contributions. And we can do that with all the different individual components. So while initially looking very simple, we can see that energy balance is this complex relationship between factors. And perhaps an important point that I think doesn't get stressed enough is that when we talk about the regulation of energy balance, we're talking about a process that occurs over weeks, if not months. And that's an important point to make, because when we look at studies looking at the effect of diet and exercise on eating behaviour, they're often done over hours and days. So people are looking for the influence of these factors on the regulation over time periods where regulation just isn't going to occur. What we also know is that this energy balance system is a dynamic rather than a static system. And by that I mean if we perturb any one of those individual components that I've shown, we're likely to see compensation in other areas. So there's a ripple effect through this energy balance system. And what we find is when we perturb these components through diet or exercise, we can elicit compensation in other areas that, for example, undermines or attenuates our attempts to create energy deficit. And those compensatory mechanisms can be physiological or behavioural in orientation. Unfortunately, we also know that energy balance is asymmetrical. And by that I mean that it seems to respond much more strongly to negative energy deficits than it does energy surfeit or overconsumption. So when we lose weight, we get a range of biological factors that change energy expenditure and energy intake, but we don't seem to see the same strength of compensation when we overconsume foods, for example. And I often hear about how appetite is strongly regulated. And that's often because people say that we have these peripheral and central mechanisms that influence food intake. But I would question whether appetite is strongly regulated. Certainly during periods of energy deficit, we see these strong factors or control mechanisms that influence food intake. But I would argue that it's the absence of strong regulation during periods of energy balance or periods of slight positive energy balance that most people operate in, when coupled with the environment, that means it's so easy for us to gain weight. So what I want to start to do is talk a little bit around some of these compensatory mechanisms that we see with weight loss. And we've touched quite a lot this morning on some of these energy expenditure related values, and I want to start to talk a little bit more around energy intake. And I've tried to put this together, this slide, really to summarize what we're looking at. So let's take a scenario where we create an energy deficit and weight loss through diet. Well, kind of by definition, we're changing body composition, but we're changing fat and fat-free mass, you know, and we can vary the kind of composition of that weight loss through various factors that I'll talk about in a moment. But by changing fat and fat-free mass, we're also altering some of the physiological systems involved in the control of appetite. So for example, if I reduce fat mass, we know that we change the concentrations in circulating leptin. And that can influence not only the kind of homeostatic appetite system, but also those systems that are involved in food reward, for example. And we've heard earlier around if we perhaps change fat-free mass and we reduce fat-free mass, that's going to have consequences for most, if not all, of the components of total daily energy expenditure. So by changing body composition through manipulation of energy balance, we're changing these physiological regulatory systems that influence appetite. So what we see is then potentially changes in our energy balance behaviours. So not just how much people eat, but potentially their food preferences and how rewarding they find the food. And we also might change the energy they expend or the energy cost of locomotion and movement, and potentially how much movement they're doing. So what we find is that physiology is acting as a pull on behaviour during these periods of negative energy deficit. Now, people have tried to, there has been some attempt to try and quantify how much or the relative proportion of compensation between expenditure and intake. And there isn't a huge amount of literature on this area, and I think that perhaps reflects the complexities that we face in measuring both food intake and daily energy expenditure in the free live environment, particularly at scale. But to me, energy intake seems to be the primary route through which people compensate for energy deficits. So we see quantifiably significant changes in energy expenditure, but changes in energy intake seem to be, I think, the primary route through compensation that occurs. Just to add another layer of complexity, we know we can change the characteristics of weight loss through a variety of different mechanisms. So both the rate and extent of weight loss, individual starting body composition, protein composition of the diet during weight loss, and exercise, for example, all change those composition of weight loss, and then potentially downstream effects on the physiology and behavioural changes. So there's a lot of complexity going on here. So let's try and orientate ourselves with appetite, because we said changes in food intake are potentially important mechanism through which we compensate for energy deficit. So I tried to put a very simple kind of schematic together to try and explain the short-term meal-to-meal control of food intake. So let's have this scenario where we've got 3 main meals, a breakfast, lunch and an even meal, then a couple of snacks thrown in. If we were to use visual analog scales and trying to measure subjective sensations of hunger, we would see a little pattern like this. And it's not kind of rocket science, really. We see that in the fasted state, say in the morning, hunger is high, but as soon as we consume a meal, we get this very rapid reduction in subjective sensations of hunger. But during this intermeal period, we get this transient increase in subjective hunger. What we can do, we can also map some of those subjective sensations onto some of these gut hormones that we think influence food intake. So we know that there are a range of hormones released from primarily the small intestine that act as physiological cues for hunger and perhaps provide information from the periphery around energy and nutrient composition of the foods that we consume. And those satiety hormones include things like GLP-1, PBY, etc. And those hormones are thought to suppress food intake and hunger. So they're satiety-based hormones. So what you find is, upon consumption of food, their concentrations increase significantly within the blood. And that tends to map quite nicely onto these subjective changes in hunger and suppression in hunger. But when those foods are being digested and no longer within the gastrointestinal tract, we lose the stimuli for their release. And then in this intermeal period, we get these increases in subjective hunger, which seem to map onto the decreases in the satiety hormones. As James talked earlier, we have got this hormone ghrelin, however, that seems to stimulate food intake, so the pattern is in reverse. Ghrelin is highest in the fasted state or immediately before a meal. Maybe I need to change this little trace here to reflect this second meal effect. But we see that these satiety-based hormones and ghrelin act as a meal-to-meal kind of control of food intake. We do, however, need to try and map our day-to-day feeding onto longer-term energy needs. So what we find is we have a longer-term or a tonic signalling system, and they are signals predominantly from adipose tissue, i.e. leptin, but also things like fat-free mass and RMR. And together these signals seem to be able to increase or decrease the sensitivity of these short-term systems in order to try and map day-to-day food intakes onto longer-term energy needs. So, as I said, a bit of a whistle-top tour, but let's try and start now understand what happens with energy deficit. And I want to start with dietary-induced energy deficit. And I've put together a little kind of model here and use some data from the Melby paper shown there as well to try and understand what happens. So if we take an individual and we get them to lose weight through diet, what we find, or what we typically assume will happen, is we get an increase in our subjective appetite ratings. People feel hungrier. We can map those back to some of these satiety hormones and ghrelin that we talked about. So with weight loss, we typically see that ghrelin increases, which would predict increases hunger, and we also get a reduction in the concentrations of our satiety-based hormones. So the functional consequence of that would be to increase hunger and reduce satiety. I'm not going to talk too much here, but we also, at the same time, when people lose weight, we know that we're losing metabolic active tissue, so therefore energy expenditure declines. And we also then potentially have this concept of adaptive thermogenesis, where we get additional reductions in energy expenditure that are not accounted for or explained by changes in body composition. So we almost have this double whammy effect for people trying to lose weight through diet, whereas their motivation to consume food is increasing, their energy expenditure is falling, yet they're still trying to maximize the energy deficit. So we can see why it's hard for individuals to lose weight and particularly maintain that weight loss over longer term periods. However, I'll skip through these two studies. However, what I've been quite interested recently is to see whether these changes in hunger are inevitable. Will you always see increases of hunger with weight loss? And actually, when you start to look at the literature, studies showing increase in hunger with weight loss are probably equally matched with studies showing no change or reductions in hunger. And I've got an example here from a meta-analysis in 2015 that looked at very low-calorie diets. So these 600 to 800 calorie diets were often meal replacements. And what they essentially found is, despite significant weight loss, 10 kilograms plus, there were no changes in subjective hunger with these very low-calorie diets. There was a 2.6 millimeter reduction in visual angular scales, about 3%, so you wouldn't really say that's clinically meaningful. But the point is, there was no increase in subjective hunger despite significant weight loss. People are also very interested in some of the mechanisms behind that, and now the effects of different sort of diets. And we see this real kind of focus on low carbohydrate ketogenic diets. And again, with ketogenic diets, there's some evidence that despite significant weight loss, we get no changes in hunger, and actually an attenuation in the changes in ghrelin we'd typically assume. So again, from the, say, meta-analysis, showing that hunger decreased by 5.5 millimeters or percent with these ketogenic diets. Only 3 studies in this meta-analysis, but there's been more studies published to date, particularly by Katia Martins, kind of reinforcing these kind of points. Interestingly, this ketogenic state or suppression of hunger seems to only last when people are actually in this ketogenic state. So if you take an individual who is ketogenic and has lost weight, but then you refeed them or increase their carbohydrate intake and take them out of ketosis, their hunger seems to increase and their ghrelin concentrations tend to increase. So there seems to be something about being in this kind of ketogenic state that suppresses appetite. I've talked a little bit around some of these gut hormones, and I just want to briefly touch on, does changes in fat-free mass have any consequence to appetite during weight loss? And we can come back to one of the classic kind of studies in physiology, the Keyes semi-starvation study. And this is where they took a group of lean individuals through very significant or severe weight loss. So they lost about 25% of their initial body weight, given their starting BMI was about 22. That's a lot of weight to lose. They then had a 12-week period of controlled refeeding, and then a 10-week period of ad libitum feeding, where they were kind of just let loose and consume as much food as they liked. What they found is that fat mass was significantly reduced during the energy restriction period, but actually there was fat overshoot during the restricted and the libitum refeeding, such that the regain of fat mass exceeded the initial baseline levels. But interestingly, when fat mass returned to baseline levels, individuals were still hyperphagic. They were still really hungry. And hyperphagia persisted until fat-free mass was restored back to baseline levels. And the conclusion from this study was that non-adipostatic signals are also involved in appetite control. And that's an area I think that isn't particularly well researched within the literature. It's very much around gut hormones and fat mass. Clearly, semi-starvation, 25% weight loss is very extreme. So is there evidence in more realistic therapeutic kind of sessions? So this is a study from Jake Terici from Leeds, who works with James Stubbs, reanalyzing some of the Diogenes kind of data. So a much more real-life environment with a very low-calorie diet that elicited 8% weight loss with then a weight maintenance diet. And what they found is the amount of fat-free mass that you lost during the very low-calorie diet phase predicted how much weight you regained, and actually also predicted the changes in appetite during this weight loss phase. So even under more realistic environments, fat-free mass loss does seem to be influencing the changes in appetite that we see. So I can already see that I'm overrunning and I'm getting a glare from our chair. So let's move on to exercise. And what I've tried to do in this slide is just summarize some of the changes that we see in energy intake and, I guess, compensation when we move from an acute bout of exercise to short-term exercise to longer-term exercise. And what studies show very convincingly is that when individuals perform a single bout of exercise, there is no automatic increase in hunger or energy intake to offset the energy expenditure. However, if we start progressing that duration of exercise, so we get people to exercise over a 7 to 14-day period, we start to see some partial compensation or tracking of energy intake to energy expenditure. And if we increase that further to more longer-term interventions, say 3 months, again we see this continued kind of tracking. So what can we kind of determine from that? So just to kind of illustrate some of these points, we've got a couple of studies here looking at the acute effects of exercise. And what I kind of want to kind of point out here is that top panel from David Broom, now at Coventry, is that when people do an acute bout of exercise, particularly high intensity exercise over about 70% VO2 max, we often see this phenomenon of exercise-induced anorexia, where we get this suppression of hunger during exercise and for a short-term period after exercise. And that short-term suppression of hunger again seems to map on some of the changes in these satiety-based hormones. But importantly, that suppression of hunger is transient and is typically restored within an hour or two. And those changes in hunger and changes in gut peptides don't seem strong enough to elicit changes in food intake. So they don't necessarily translate into changes in food. Of course, like most things, we see huge individual variability in these responses, and perhaps one of the things that we need to have a better understanding is how or why we see such variability. If we quickly move on to this longer term processes, again, a study from James Stubbs here when he was at the Rout Institution. They took a group of lean males and females, and they got them to do 2 weeks of no exercise, 2 weeks of moderate exercise, expending about 500 calories during exercise per day, or a high dose exercise intervention where they expended 1,000 calories a day through exercise. And as would be expected, there was this stepwise increase in energy expenditure when they went from from no exercise to moderate to high. But interestingly, energy intake also increased. So it went from about 10.5 to 11.5 to 12 megajoules per day as we went from no to moderate to high dose exercise. So what this provides evidence is partial tracking of energy intake to increases in energy expenditure. But importantly, that was partial compensation. So about 30% of the energy expended, or the extra energy expended through exercise, was compensated for by energy intake. So these people were still in energy deficit, and if prolonged over time, would be losing weight. If we move that to a longer term kind of scenario, what do we see? And perhaps one of the misconceptions around exercise and its effect on appetite is that we only look at absolute changes in energy intake. But what we actually need to do is look at them in the context of total daily energy expenditure, so energy balance. And what we do that, we see this J-shaped relationship between food intake and physical activity, whereby food intake is elevated in those that are sedentary and active, but also high in those that are very active. And that initially doesn't make sense. But if we start to pop in physical activity and I guess total daily energy expenditure, we can understand it a little bit more. So what we find is that those that are physically active or sedentary operate in this non-regulated zone of appetite where there's a large gap between intake and their expenditure. But as people become more physically active, that energy gap decreases, and over time we get this tight coupling or matching between energy intake and energy expenditure. So while absolute food intake or intake is increasing, that now maps more clearly onto their energy needs or energy expenditure. And that seems to be matched by better maintenance of body weight. So I think I'm already overrunning, so just a final kind of slide to summarise. As I said, there is a very limited body examining the differences between isoenergetic energy deficits through exercise and diet on appetite. And there's a study here from David Stencil's group at Loughborough comparing isoenergetic energy deficits, as said, from diet versus exercise. And what they found is that changes in subjective appetite and food intake were greater when energy deficits were elicited through diet than exercise. And also, the changes in these gut hormones were also matching on to these changes in subjective appetite and food intake. So the implication here is that compensation of appetite seems to be less or attenuated when we use exercise to perturb energy balance than diet. But there are very few studies out there looking at that, and particularly longer term kind of studies. So I think I'm probably overrunning, so just to kind of conclude, we know energy balance is complex and there's this relationship between physiology and behaviour. But unfortunately, energy balance is asymmetrical, and we see the stronger compensation to energy deficit than we do surfeit. we really need to start developing these integrated models of weight loss where we look at changes in fat-free mass alongside changes in fat mass and gastrointestinal hormones, because I think that's going to give us a much better explanation of some of these changes in hunger. We shouldn't assume that changes in hunger are inevitable with weight loss, but we need a much better understanding of why we see such variability in response to these kind of interventions. In terms of exercise, we seem to see weaker coupling between food intake and expenditure in those that are active and sedentary, but that becomes stronger in those physical activity people, high activity people. And that means that we shouldn't just think about exercise as a way of increasing energy expenditure, but also potentially it can improve the control of appetite. So thank you very much for your time, and apologies, Chair, but I did tell you I was going to go overrun.